In the photographic archive of the Griffith Institute in Oxford, there is a glass plate negative from January of 1923, taken by a man named Harry Burton, that almost no one outside Egyptology has examined in nearly 100 years. The plate carries the catalogue number P0644. It was developed at night, in a converted tomb across the Valley of the Kings, by candlelight and silver bromide. Burton was on loan from the Metropolitan Museum's Egyptian expedition in New York. He had spent 20 years photographing the insides of other people's tombs. By 1923, he was perhaps the most patient eye in the field. The image is dim. At first, what you see is a wall of pale plaster, photographed at an angle, in low light. Then your eye finds the centre of the frame, a small clay impression, about the size of an open hand. The seal is intact. Pressed into the clay is the jackal-headed figure of Anubis, lying along the top edge of the panel. Below him are 9 bound prisoners. The rope still loops through the copper handles of the doorway. The knots are still tied. The hands that tied them belong to a priest who lived 32 centuries ago. When Burton photographed this seal, in January of 1923, he was photographing the last visible moment before it would be broken. The seal had sat undisturbed for 3,245 years. This is what we mean when we say a tomb was sealed forever. This is what those words look like in a photograph. Tonight, we're going to walk through this slowly. You do not need to hold every name in mind. You do not need to memorize the dynasties or the dates. The photographs have waited 100 years. The seal itself waited 3,000. We can take our time with them. Now, let us go back to the year that photograph was taken and ask what the standard history was prepared to say about a sealed pharaonic tomb in 1923. The standard history then as now begins long before Tutankhamun. It begins in the Old Kingdom, around 2600 before the Common Era, when an architect named Imhotep raised a step pyramid at Saqqara for a king named Djoser. By the reign of Khufu, around 2570 before the Common Era, those step pyramids had grown into the smooth-sided monuments of Giza. By the reign of Thutmose I, around 1500 before the Common Era, the pharaohs had stopped building pyramids altogether. They had moved their burials to a remote valley behind a mountain on the west bank of Thebes. We call it now the Valley of the Kings. The Egyptians called it Set Mat, the place of truth. For roughly 500 years, the pharaohs of the 18th, 19th and 20th dynasties were buried in that valley. The cliff was chosen in part because it could be sealed. There is one main entrance. Workers from a village called Deir el Medina spent their lives carving these tombs. They lived in a closed community. They left thousands of pieces of administrative ostraca, fragments of broken pottery used as notepaper, that record their daily wages, their grievances, the names of their children. We have more documentation of their domestic disputes than of the lives of the kings they buried. A pharaoh's burial in the Valley of the Kings followed a procedure. The body was carried in procession across the Nile. It was deposited in an inner chamber. The chamber was sealed with a layer of mortar and impressed with a clay seal of the necropolis. The seal was the same seal Burton photographed in 1923. Anubis above 9 bound captives. It was the official mark of the royal cemetery, applied to every tomb. A statement of jurisdiction. A statement that the burial belonged to the state and was to remain undisturbed. The standard history adds, as a matter of course, that the seals did not work. They did not work in the 18th dynasty. They did not work in the 19th. By the 20th dynasty, the situation was so bad that the kings themselves convened formal investigations into the looting of their predecessors' tombs. We have those investigations in writing. The most famous of them is held today in the British Museum, in the Department of Egypt and Sudan, under the catalogue name Papyrus Abbot. It dates to the 16th year of the reign of Rameses IX, around 1100 before the Common Era. The papyrus records a commission, ordered by the pharaoh, to inspect the royal tombs on the west bank at Thebes and report whether they had been disturbed. The commission walked the necropolis. They reported on tomb after tomb. They reported that most of them were intact. They reported that one, the tomb of the 17th dynasty pharaoh Sobekemsaf II, had been broken into. They named the suspects. They described, with bureaucratic precision, how the robbers had tunnelled in. What the Abbot Papyrus tells us, in the careful handwriting of a New Kingdom clerk, is that by 1100 before the Common Era, the state already knew its sealed tombs were not sealed. The state had a process for asking the question, The state had a vocabulary for the answer, thi arbim. There is a detail in this papyrus that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. In several places, the commission notes that the seals are still in place, but the tomb has been entered. The seals are still in place, but the tomb has been entered. The robbers evidently had learned to break through the wall around the seal and leave the seal itself untouched, or to enter from above or below, or to bribe the necropolis guards and reseal the door behind themselves. The seal alone, then, meant nothing. Howard Carter knew this when he stood in front of the door of Tutankhamun's tomb in November of 1922. He had spent 30 years digging in Egypt. He had worked under Flinders Petrie at Amarna in 1892. He had served as Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt under Gaston Maspero from 1899 to 1904. He had personally cleared half a dozen looted tombs in the Valley of the Kings before he ever set eyes on Tutankhamun's. He knew that a sealed door by itself usually meant nothing. Then he saw the door of the tomb of Tutankhamun, according to his excavation journal, now digitized at the Griffith Institute and freely available at Griffith. Oksang UK, the entry for November 4th, 1922, reads only a few lines. A workman, clearing rubble below the entrance to the tomb of Rameses VI, had uncovered a single rock-cut step. By November 5th, they had cleared the second step. By the 24th, they had cleared the entire staircase. There were 16 steps in all. At the bottom of the staircase was a plaster wall. The plaster wall was stamped with seal impressions. Some of the seals showed Anubis above 9 bound captives, the seal of the necropolis. Some showed the personal name of a pharaoh, Tutankhamun. Carter's journal records that the wall had been replastered twice, in antiquity, after the original burial. Twice, in other words, the tomb had been entered. Twice it had been resealed by the priests of the necropolis. He had expected disappointment. He cut a small hole in the corner of the wall. He held a candle to the opening. Lord Carnarvon, who had funded the dig, was behind him, asking what could be seen. Carter, in his own published account, gives the line as yes, wonderful things. What Carter saw when he looked through that hole was the antechamber of a tomb that had been broken into twice in antiquity, that had been resealed twice by the priests, and that had then been left undisturbed for 3,245 years. The robbers, whoever they were, had not finished, or had not understood what they were stealing, or had been interrupted. Whatever the reason, the inner chambers had survived. The standard history of Tutankhamun's tomb, the one taught in classrooms, often skips this detail. It says the tomb was sealed and intact. It says it was untouched. This is partially true, and partially not. The outer seals had been broken and remade. The inner seals, on the door of the second shrine inside the burial chamber, had not. Those were the seals Burton photographed in January of 1923. Those were the seals that had held for 32 centuries. The Tutankhamun discovery was, in this sense, an exception inside an exception. Almost every royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings had been entered before any modern excavator arrived. Almost every royal mummy known to scholarship in 1922 had been moved, restored, rewrapped or hidden by the priests of later dynasties. The pharaohs themselves had been gathered up and stowed away in 2 great hiding places. The first was found in 1881, the second in 1898. Both will return in this story. The standard history acknowledges all of this. It does not hide it. You can find the inventory of mummies from the 1881 cache published in 1889 by Gaston Maspero in a volume called Les Momies Royales de Deir el-Bahari. It is still in print. You can find Victor Loret's notes on the 1898 cache in the publications of the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo. These are not secret documents. What the standard history does not always state plainly is the shape of the pattern. Tomb after tomb, century after century. Sealed and reopened, sometimes sealed again by the very people who were supposed to be guarding them. Sometimes resealed for centuries, sometimes resealed for millennia. The phrase "the tomb was sealed" has, in the actual record, a long history of meaning many different things. The seal was made, the seal was broken. The seal was photographed 3,000 years later. This is the context Carter walked into in 1922. This is the context Burton's photograph belongs to. Now let us pause for a moment on Burton himself, because it matters who held the camera. Harry Burton was born in Lincolnshire in 1879. He arrived in Egypt in 1910 as a photographer for the American archaeologist Theodore Davis. By 1914, he had moved to the staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Egyptian Expedition, based at Deir el-Bahri, across the river from Luxor. When Howard Carter discovered the steps to the tomb in November of 1922, he sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon. He sent a second telegram, almost immediately, to the Met, asking if Burton could be loaned to the dig. The Met agreed. Burton stayed for 10 years. He took, by the most conservative count, around 3,400 photographs of the tomb and its contents. He took them with 2 large format cameras on glass plates. He used magnesium flares, and once, when those were not sufficient, he reflected sunlight from the desert above the tomb down through the chambers by way of a series of polished metal mirrors. He photographed every object in situ before it was moved. He photographed every object again after it was moved. He photographed the seals. He photographed the dust on the floor. He photographed the impressions of feet that had been left, in antiquity, by the priest who had resealed the doorway. His negatives are held today in 2 places. About half are at the Metropolitan Museum's Department of Egyptian Art Archives in New York. About half are at the Griffith Institute in Oxford. The Griffith Institute has digitised nearly all of them. You can look at them yourself this evening at Griffith. Ox.ac.uk/Geary. I have spent a long time with these photographs. They are the most carefully made record we have of any ancient burial, anywhere in the world. They are also, in some ways, the loneliest record. Burton's images often have no people in them at all. He waited for the workmen to leave the chamber before he took the picture. He waited for Carter and Carnarvon to step out of frame. What you see in most of the Burton plates is the inside of a sealed tomb, photographed from the position of someone who is no longer alive, by a man who would die in 1940 in Asyut. Having spent his career in spaces meant never to be opened. Now let us go back further, because the question of sealed tombs in Egypt did not begin with Tutankhamun. It did not begin with the Valley of the Kings. It did not begin in 1922. It is older than that, much older, and the record of it, in European archives, is older too. In 1646, an English astronomer named John Greaves published a book called Pyramidographia, or a description of the pyramids in Egypt. Greaves was civilian professor of astronomy at Oxford. He had travelled to Giza in 1638 with a small set of measuring tools and a quadrant. He climbed the Great Pyramid. He entered the Grand Gallery. He stood inside the King's Chamber. He measured the dimensions of the sarcophagus. He wrote the first scientific description of the interior of an Egyptian pyramid in English, and one of the first in any modern European language. A copy is held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. In 1755, a Danish naval officer named Frederick Louis Norden published a book called Voyage d'Egypte et de Nubie, based on drawings he had made in 1737 and 1738. Norden's volume contains over 200 engravings. 29 of them are detailed maps of the Nile. One of them depicts what Norden called the Fourth Pyramid at Giza, a structure that no longer appears in modern guidebooks. We will return to that pyramid in a later part of this story. Between 1798 and 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. He brought with him 160 scholars. They surveyed the country for 3 years. The results were published in 20 volumes between 1809 and 1828. The series was called Description de l'Egypte. The Library of Congress holds a complete first edition. Catalogue item number 6108. It is one of the largest books ever printed in France. The plates alone are taller than a man. In 1822, in Paris, a young scholar named Jean-François Champollion stood before the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres and read a letter explaining how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. The reading of the language followed. The reading of the country did not follow immediately. Between 1817 and 1820, a former circus strongman named Giovanni Battista Belzoni broke through 3 sealed plaster walls in succession to enter the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb is now catalogued as KV17. It is the longest and deepest tomb in the valley. The sarcophagus inside was already empty. Seti's mummy was not there. It would be found, 64 years later, in a hiding place at Deir el-Bahri. Between 1851 and 1854, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette used gunpowder to enter a sealed underground complex at Saqqara. He found himself in a long corridor lined with vaults. In each vault was a single granite sarcophagus. The sarcophagi were up to 70 tons each. They had been carved from single blocks of stone. They had been lowered into vaults too small to remove them through. Inside them were the embalmed bodies of bulls. In 1849 and 1850, a French photographer named Maxime Ducamp made the first systematic photographic survey of the monuments of Egypt using the calotype process. He published 125 images in a volume called Egypte, Nubie, Palestine, Syrie, in 1852. His negatives are held at the Biblioteque Nationale de France and at the Metropolitan Museum. They are the earliest photographs we have of the pyramids, of the Sphinx, of the temples of Karnak and Luxor. Each of these projects, you will notice, was an act of opening, an act of unsealing. The history of modern Egyptology is, in a sense, the history of breaking into sealed rooms, photographing what was inside, and writing down the inventory. This is the part of the story the standard history tells well. It is the part of the story that is easy to tell because the records are clear and the methods are documented. What is harder to tell is what was already missing by the time anyone arrived to write the inventory. That is the question this story is going to walk into very slowly, beginning with a single sealed door in the Valley of the Kings and ending, hours from now, somewhere underneath the floor of the Great Pyramid. Let us begin where the door begins. The plaster wall at the bottom of the 16 steps was, by Carter's measurement, 2 meters wide and about 1.5 meters tall. The plaster had been applied in a single coat and then sealed while still wet, with impressions from at least 3 different stamps. There was the necropolis seal, Anubis above 9 bound captives. There was a cartouche-shaped stamp bearing the name Tutankhamun. There was a third seal, less clear, which Carter eventually identified as belonging to the personal staff of the burial. When Carter cut his small hole in the corner of the wall, he was opening not the tomb itself, but a corridor. The corridor was 9 meters long. The corridor was filled, floor to ceiling, with stone chips and rubble. It took the team 3 weeks to clear it. At the end of the corridor was a second sealed door. This second door was the same as the first. Plaster stamped with the same 3 seals, broken open at least once in antiquity, and patched up again with newer mortar. On November 26, 1922, Carter and Carnarvon stood before this second door. Carter, in his published account, made another small hole. He held a candle. The candle flickered, drawing back, which Carter took as a sign of escaping gas from the chamber within. He waited until the air had stabilized. Then he widened the hole and put his head through it. What he saw, in the light of the candle, was a room he could not at first make sense of. He described it later in his book The Tomb of Tut, Ankh, Amen, published in 1923 as a chaos of shapes, animals, statues, gold. Everywhere, gold. The room was the antechamber. It was about 8 meters long and 3.5 wide. Against the far wall stood 3 large gilded couches, each in the shape of a different animal. Beneath the couches and around them were piled hundreds of objects. Boxes containing folded linens. A throne plated with gold and inlaid with semi-precious stones. 2 life-size statues of the king, painted black with gold accents, facing each other across a doorway. Chariots dismantled, leaning against the walls. Bows, sandals, walking sticks. A small mound of perfume jars made of alabaster. To one side of the antechamber was a smaller room. Carter called it the annex. It had been thoroughly looted. Robbers had crawled through a hole in the wall, evidently in haste, and turned the room upside down. Carter would later count more than 2,000 objects in this room alone. They were all still there. They had simply been thrown around. Whatever the robbers had taken, they had not taken much. Carter's eventual estimate, based on the inventories painted on the boxes by the original burial staff, was that about 60% of the original contents of the tomb were still present when he found it. Some perfume oils had been removed, some jewellery, a small number of metal objects perhaps. But the bulk of the burial was intact. To the right of the antechamber was another sealed wall, plaster, stamped, broken once in antiquity, and resealed. This was the entrance to the burial chamber. Carter did not open it that day. He sealed up his small hole, posted a guard, and went to Cairo to telegram the Egyptian Antiquities Service. The official opening of the burial chamber would take place on February 17th, 1923, in the presence of the Queen of the Belgians, the Egyptian Minister of Public Works, about 20 invited guests and Harry Burton with his camera. When that wall came down, what stood inside the burial chamber was a wooden box. Not a small box. The box almost filled the chamber. It was 5 meters long, 3 1/3 wide, 2 3/4 meters tall. It was made of cedar, covered in gold leaf, and decorated with a pattern of blue faience tiles. Carter and his team had to enter the burial chamber sideways, against the walls, in the narrow gap between the box and the painted plaster. The box was a shrine. Inside the first shrine was a second shrine. Inside the second shrine was a third. Inside the third was a fourth. Inside the fourth was a stone sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold. Inside the innermost coffin was the mummy of the king. The doors of the first shrine had been opened. The seal had been broken and remade. The robbers, or the priests who came after the robbers, had gotten that far. The doors of the second shrine had not. This is the seal Burton photographed. The clay impression of Anubis above 9 bound captives, tied with cord across the bolt and the staple of the second shrine, undisturbed since the burial party left the tomb in roughly 1323 before the Common Era. 3,245 years. The seal is small, about the size of a closed fist. The cord is still attached to it. The cord is still tied. The metal hardware is still in place. You can see in the photograph the texture of the wood grain beneath the gold leaf where the cord passes over it. That is what the photograph shows. Now let us hold this image in mind and walk for a moment across the valley. About 600 meters west of Tutankhamun's tomb, also carved into the same cliffs, is a tomb known to scholarship as KV-17, the tomb of Seti I, father of Rameses the Great, one of the most powerful pharaohs of the 19th dynasty. He reigned for about 14 years from around 1294 to 1279, before the Common Era, and he was buried in a tomb that is, by every measurement, more impressive than Tutankhamun's. KV-17 is the longest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It descends 137 meters into the cliff. Its walls are covered, floor to ceiling, with the most elaborate funerary text and astronomical ceilings ever painted in any royal tomb in Egypt. When Giovanni Belzoni broke through the sealed plaster wall of KV-17 in October of 1817, he was the first modern European to set foot inside. Belzoni was a former circus strongman from Padua. He stood by various accounts somewhere around 2 meters tall. He had come to Egypt to sell a water lifting machine to the Pasha. The machine had failed. He had turned to archaeology in the loose 19th century sense of the word, which meant entering monuments by any means available, including battering rams and gunpowder. Belzoni found KV-17 by following the path of water through the limestone. After a heavy rain, he noticed that water was disappearing into a particular spot in the valley floor. He had his crew dig there. Beneath the rubble they uncovered a sealed door. Belzoni broke through it. Behind it was a corridor. He broke through 3 more sealed walls, in sequence, descending deeper into the cliff. At the bottom of the descent, in a vaulted chamber painted with constellations, he found a sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was made of a single piece of calcite, sometimes called Egyptian alabaster. It is translucent. When you hold a candle to it, the stone glows. The sarcophagus was carved on every interior and exterior surface, with the entire text of the Book of Gates, a New Kingdom funerary composition describing the 12 hours of the night through which the soul of the king must pass to reach the morning. The sarcophagus was empty. The body of Seti I was not in his tomb. The burial regalia was not in his tomb. The 4 canopic jars were not in his tomb. The Shapti figurines, of which there should have been at least 400, were not in his tomb. Almost everything portable had been removed. The seals had been broken. The corridors had been entered. The body of one of the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom was gone. It would surface, 64 years later, in the cliffs above Deir el-Bahri. Now let us go to that cliff, in the year 1881. There is, on the west bank of the Nile across from Luxor, a vertical limestone face rising about 300 meters above the desert floor. At its base sits the mortuary temple of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Above the temple, in a fold of the cliff, is a narrow shaft. The shaft is 12 meters deep. At the bottom is a horizontal corridor. The corridor twists, descends, and opens into a series of small chambers cut from the rock. The shaft is catalogued today as TT320. In the summer of 1881, an Egyptian local named Mohammed Abd el-Rasul of the village of Kurna walked into the office of Daoud Pasha in Luxor and confessed that he and his brothers had 10 years earlier discovered something in the cliffs above Deir el-Bahri. They had been keeping it secret. They had been selling its contents, piece by piece, on the antiquities market. Egyptologists in Cairo had begun to notice with increasing alarm that royal funerary objects bearing the names of major 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs were appearing in private collections in Europe with no clear provenance. The Egyptian authorities, under Auguste Mariette's successor Gaston Maspero, had been hunting for the source for years. When Abdel Rasoul confessed, Maspero sent his deputy, Emile Brugsch, with a small Egyptian and German team. Brugsch was lowered into the shaft on a rope on June 25, 1881. He carried a torch. What he found in the chambers at the bottom was not one royal burial. It was 40. The mummies of Seti I, of Rameses II, of Thutmose III, of Thutmose I, of Amenhotep I, of Ahmose, founder of the New Kingdom, and of Rameses IX himself, the very pharaoh whose investigators had written the Abbot papyrus, were stacked in the corridor and the side chambers, wrapped in linen, labelled with hieratic dockets identifying their original tombs. In 2 days, working in suffocating heat, Brugsch and his crew loaded the entire cache onto boats and shipped it down the Nile to Cairo. There was no time for systematic photography. There was no time for archaeological context. The cache was emptied in the way that, by 1881, Egyptian artifacts had been emptied for 100 years, rapidly, imperfectly, with a sense that the documents could be sorted out later. Most of the dockets on the mummies, written in hieratic script by the priests who had hidden them, gave dates in the reigns of the high priests of Amun of the 21st dynasty. The relevant names were Pinegem I, his son Masahata, and his grandson Pinegem II. Pinegem II was high priest from about 990 to 969 before the Common Era. His own family burial was in this same shaft. What the dockets describe in matter-of-fact administrative language is a campaign of consolidation. Sometime in the late 20th and early 21st dynasties, when the central authority of the New Kingdom collapsed and the Valley of the Kings could no longer be policed, the priests of Amun went into the royal tombs, one by one, and gathered up the bodies of the kings. They unwrapped them, they examined them, they patched them, they rewrapped them, sometimes with new linen, sometimes with fragments of the original wrappings of other kings. They wrote little hieratic notes on the bandages, explaining what they had done, and on what date, and under whose authority. Then they moved the kings to caches. 2 of these caches survive. TT320 is one. The other is KB35. KB35 is the tomb of Amenhotep II, which was opened by Victor Loret in March of 1898. Loret was, at the time, the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. He had been appointed the year before. He spoke fluent Arabic. He kept extensive notes. When Loret entered Cave 35, he found Amenhotep II still in his sarcophagus, the first king found in modern times, in his own original burial chamber. It was the only such case until Tutankhamun. But Amenhotep was not alone in his tomb. In a side chamber, sealed and plastered, Loret found 9 more royal mummies. Among them were Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Merneptah, Seti II, Siptah, Rameses IV, Rameses V, and Rameses VI, the pharaoh whose tomb sat directly above Tutankhamun's, and whose construction rubble would later cover and protect Tutankhamun's entrance for 3,000 years. A second side chamber held 3 unidentified mummies. One of them was a woman. Recent DNA testing has suggested she may be Queen Tiye, the mother of Akhenaten, the grandmother of Tutankhamun. What we have then is a pattern. The royal tombs of the New Kingdom were entered and stripped, in antiquity, sometimes within decades of the burial. The priests of the 21st dynasty rescued what they could of the bodies. They moved the bodies into 2 hiding places. The hiding places held for roughly 3,000 years. They were rediscovered, by chance and by confession, in the late 19th century. Their contents were rushed to Cairo. And in 1922, in a small valley just over the hill, Howard Carter and his workmen uncovered a 16-step staircase that led to an antechamber and an annex and a burial chamber, where 4 nested shrines and 3 nested coffins concealed a body that had been missed, a body the priests had failed to find, a body the robbers had failed to take, a body that lay with a small sealed clay impression on a wooden bolt above it. for 32 centuries. This is the standard history of the Tutankhamun discovery, told carefully. It is also the standard history of every other sealed tomb in Egypt, told carefully, because every other sealed tomb tells the same story. Sealed, broken, resealed, broken again, sealed by priests, broken by robbers, sealed by landslide, broken by gunpowder. The seal on a pharaonic tomb, in the long view of Egyptian history, is not a guarantee. It is a hope. What I keep coming back to, looking at Burton's photograph of the seal on the second shrine, is how thin the wood is beneath the cord. The cord crosses the wooden bolt at a slight angle. The clay impression sits on top, no thicker than a coin. There's nothing about it, materially, that should have held for 3,000 years. A child could have broken it with a finger. The priests, presumably, had broken seals like this all over the valley. The robbers had broken seals like this for centuries. This one held. Whether by accident, or by the failure of attention, or because the room was simply forgotten under the floor of a later tomb, this one held. And so the photograph exists. Now let us pause here before we move into the next part of the story, and ask a question the standard history does not always answer directly. If the priests of the 21st dynasty moved most of the royal mummies of the New Kingdom out of their original tombs, and if they did so under the authority of named officials whose dockets we still have, then what else did they move? What else in the long catalogue of pharaonic burial goods was carried out of the original tombs and into hiding? What else was rewrapped, relabelled, relocated, and lost? The question is one that in the strictest sense cannot be answered. We do not have a complete inventory of what each of these tombs originally contained. We have the inventories painted on the boxes inside Tutankhamun's tomb, which describe a tomb we now possess. We have a small number of other surviving lists. We have the negative space of objects mentioned in funerary texts but never found in any tomb anywhere. Beyond that, we have absence, and absence does not list itself. But let us look at 3 other cases that complicate the picture in different directions. The first case takes us back in time to the Old Kingdom. In February of 1925, the photographer of the joint Harvard-Boston expedition to Giza, a man named Muhammadani Ibrahim, was setting up his tripod on level ground east of the Great Pyramid. The tripod's legs slipped through a thin crust of plaster. Beneath the plaster was a vertical shaft, sealed at its top with limestone blocks and packed with rubble for 30 metres down. George Reisner, the expedition's director, was teaching at Harvard that winter. The on-site dig was being run by his assistant Alan Rowe. Rowe cleared the shaft over the following weeks. At its base, on the north side, was a small horizontal chamber, sealed in antiquity with a wall of blocks. The blocks were not stamped with seals as Tutankhamun's doors had been. They were simply blocks, dry laid and mortared, in a way that suggested the chamber had been closed quickly and quietly. When Reisner returned to Giza in March of 1927, and the time had come to open the inner wall, he insisted on a degree of ceremony almost unprecedented in Egyptian archaeology. He invited the Egyptian Antiquities Service. He invited the British resident. He had still photographers and a cinematographer brought in. The wall was opened in front of witnesses, slowly, course by course. Inside was a small chamber, roughly square, about 5 metres on a side. It was filled with the disordered remains of a royal burial. A gilded wooden bed, collapsed. A carrying chair, gold-covered, with hieroglyphs naming its owner. A canopy frame in pieces. Silver bracelets in a small reed box. The owner was identified at once. She was Hetepheres I, mother of Khufu, wife of Sneferu, the matriarch of the 4th dynasty. At the back of the chamber, against the wall, stood a sarcophagus of alabaster. The lid was in place. The sarcophagus was sealed. For weeks, Reisner prepared the next stage. The lid was raised on March 3, 1927, in front of the same audience. The light fell into the interior. Reisner, in his official report and in private letters, held now at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, recorded what he saw. The sarcophagus was empty. It contained no body, no bandages, no fragments of jewellery, no dust of bone. Nothing. A short distance away, in a small niche in the chamber's southern wall, was a canopic chest, also sealed. When this chest was opened, it contained 4 compartments. The The compartments held the natron-preserved viscera of Hetepheres intact. The body of the queen had been removed, her organs had not. Reisner thought about this for years. The hypothesis he eventually published, and which remains the standard explanation in Egyptological literature, is that Hetepheres had originally been buried at Dahshur, near Sneferu's pyramid. Her tomb there had been robbed in antiquity, perhaps within a generation of her burial. The body had been destroyed or stripped of valuables and discarded. A senior official, perhaps the vizier himself, had discovered the violation. He had collected what remained of the burial equipment, and the canopic chest which the robbers had ignored, and he had moved everything to the secret shaft at Giza without telling Khufu that his mother's body had been desecrated. The shaft was sealed. The king was not informed. The ceremony of mourning had already been performed. That is the standard hypothesis. Other Egyptologists have proposed variants. Some have suggested the shaft was a cenotaph from the beginning, intended to hold only the canopic chest, with the body always lying elsewhere. Others have suggested an entirely symbolic burial in honour of a queen whose body had simply decayed before the proper preparations could be made. The point for our purposes is not which hypothesis is correct. The point is that as early as the 4th dynasty, more than 1,000 years before Tutankhamun, the sealed tomb of a member of the royal family at Giza had already been opened and emptied at least once in antiquity, and then sealed again, and then opened again in 1927. The pattern that we observed at Thebes, at Tanis, at Saqqara runs all the way back. Now let us go to a small valley on the west bank of the Nile, just south of the Valley of the Kings. The valley is called Deir el-Medina. It was the home of the workmen who carved and decorated the royal tombs. In the year 1906, the Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli was conducting a survey of the hillside above the workmen's village. He was looking for the tombs of the workmen themselves. He found several. Then, on February 15th of that year, his crew uncovered something different. It was the entrance to a tomb. A modest entrance, the kind a high-ranking workman might have built for himself. There were two parts to it. There was an above-ground chapel, partly collapsed, and there was a shaft leading down to a sealed door. The shaft had not been entered. The seal had not been broken. The reason, when Schiaparelli examined the slope around the entrance, became clear. At some point in antiquity, perhaps within decades of the burial, a landslide on the hillside above had buried the entrance under several meters of debris. The chapel had been crushed. The shaft had been concealed. The seal had been left alone by accident because no one knew where to look. When Schiaparelli opened the inner chamber, what he found was a tomb completely undisturbed. The owner of the tomb was a man named Ka. Ka had served 3 pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and Amenhotep III. His title was Chief of Works in the Place of Truth, which meant he was the senior official in charge of constructing royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The tombs of Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III, both of which we now know were robbed in antiquity, were built under his supervision. Inside Ka's tomb was a small chapel-like room. In the centre, on a sled-shaped base, was a wooden canopy. Inside the canopy was the coffin of Ka himself, and beside it the coffin of his wife Merit. Around them, on the floor and against the walls, were arranged the contents of an upper-middle-class New Kingdom household. There were 2 beds, fully made up with linen sheets and pillows. There were chairs and stools. There was a small wooden box containing a complete set of cosmetics, with vessels of coal and perfume oils, still in liquid form, still smelling faintly of resin. There was a board game made of ebony and ivory. There was a set of cubits, marked with the official length standards of the 18th dynasty. There were loaves of bread, blackened by time but intact in their shapes. There were figs in a wooden bowl. There was a wig, belonging to Merit, with its hairpin still inserted, lying inside a leather case. Schiaparelli moved the entire assemblage, with permission from the Egyptian authorities, to the Museo Egizio in Turin, where it remains today. It is the most complete intact New Kingdom burial ever recovered. 440 objects, more or less. None missing, none disturbed since the doors closed in roughly 1350 before the Common Era. What protected the tomb of Ka was not the seal. What protected the tomb of Ka was the landslide that buried the seal. The seal itself, when uncovered, was no different in design or stamp from the seals on the doors of every other tomb in the valley, all of which were broken. The seal was not the lock. The seal was a sign that said, "This is private. Do not enter." The lock, when there was one, was geography. Now, let us go forward almost a century, and across the Nile to a different cemetery. In January of 2014, the American Egyptologist Joseph Wegener of the University of Pennsylvania Museum was excavating in a desert wadi about half a kilometre south of the great tomb of Senwosret III at Abydos. Wegener had been working at Abydos for 2 decades. He was not looking that season for a royal tomb. He was looking for the supporting structures of a Middle Kingdom mortuary complex. What he found, when his trench cut into a small mound of disturbed sand, was the upper edge of a stone burial chamber. The chamber was small, about 6 metres by 3. It had been robbed in antiquity. The body, when Wegener uncovered it, was lying on the floor in a disarray that suggested it had been pulled out of its coffin and stripped of jewellery. The wooden parts of the burial had decayed almost completely, but the walls of the chamber were painted. Carved into the stone in deep relief was the cartouche of the king buried there. The name was Senebkai. The throne name was Waseribre. No king with that name appears in any of the surviving Egyptian king lists. No king with that name appears in Manetho, the 3rd century before the Common Era priest whose Egyptiaca survives in fragments and forms the backbone of pharaonic chronology. No king with that name had ever been confirmed by any prior excavation in Egypt. Senebkay was the first physical evidence of a dynasty that the Danish scholar Kim Ryholt had proposed in his 1997 study, The Political Situation in Egypt, during the Second Intermediate Period, as the Abydos dynasty. Ryholt had argued, on the basis of fragmentary king lists and the distribution of monuments, that during the chaotic decades around 1650 before the Common Era, when the Hyksos ruled the Delta and the Theban dynasties ruled the south, a third small dynasty of perhaps a dozen kings had ruled at Abydos and disappeared from the official records of the Egyptian state. For 17 years, his hypothesis had no archaeological confirmation. Then Wegener's trench cut into Senebkai's chamber. Subsequent seasons at Abydos have located the tombs of several more kings of the same dynasty, all of them previously unknown by name, all of them robbed in antiquity, all of them omitted from the chronicles. An entire royal line, ruling for perhaps half a century, ruling perhaps with full ceremony in their own court, was edited out of the king lists by their successors and forgotten for 3,400 years. Hold this fact in mind. A dynasty can be sealed away, not only as a body in a tomb, but as a name in a record. The two processes are continuous with each other. The chamber that closes around the body and the line of writing that omits the name are both ways of placing something out of reach. Now, let us go back one more time to the largest sealed structure in the world. In October of 2017, a team of physicists from Japan, France, and Egypt published a paper in the journal Nature. The lead author was Kunihiro Morishima of Nagoya University. The team called itself the Scan Pyramids Project. It had been founded 3 years earlier, in 2015, with the cooperation of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities to apply non-invasive imaging techniques to the major pyramids at Giza and Dashur. The technique they used in the Great Pyramid was muon imaging. Muons are subatomic particles, similar to electrons but 200 times heavier, produced when cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere. They rain down on the Earth constantly. They pass through almost everything, including stone. They lose energy as they pass through dense material. By placing detectors at various points inside and around a structure, and counting the muons that arrive from each direction, you can build up a 3-dimensional image of the densities inside, in the same way a medical X-ray builds up an image of a body. 3 separate teams, using 3 different detector technologies, placed instruments inside the Queen's chamber and along the northern face of the Great Pyramid. They counted muons for months. When the data was correlated, all 3 teams independently detected the same anomaly. Above the Grand Gallery, the long ascending corridor that leads to the King's chamber, there was a void. The void was at least 30 meters long. Its cross-section was comparable to that of the Grand Gallery itself. It had not been described in any ancient or modern source. No corridor led to it from any known chamber. It was, in the most literal sense, a sealed space. The Scan Pyramids team called it the Big Void. 6 years later, in March of 2023, the same team published a second paper in Nature Communications, They had used a smaller cosmic ray detector and a 5mm endoscope inserted through an existing crack in the north face of the pyramid to confirm a second, smaller anomaly. This one was 9 meters long, located just behind the chevron blocks above the original entrance. The endoscope camera, when it transmitted its first image back, showed a corridor, vaulted, empty, with worked limestone walls that had never been seen by any human eye since the pyramid was closed in roughly 2560 before the Common Era. The pyramid, sealed for 46 centuries, was still being opened. What I keep coming back to when I read the Scan Pyramids reports is how quietly the discoveries appeared. There was no breaking through walls. There was no gunpowder. There was nothing dramatic about it at all. There was simply a long, patient count of subatomic particles made by physicists at 3 universities, accumulating in their data files over months. And at the end of that count, a corridor that had been missing from the maps for 4,500 years was simply there, listed, measured, inserted calmly into the record. I'll continue the script from where it left off, moving through late Act 3 into Act 4 implications, cross-region patterns, the Abbott papyrus, cultural memory, the contested Nefertiti claim. About 2,400 words. What I keep coming back to about the Scan Pyramids result is not the size of the void, which is considerable, or the technique, which is elegant. It is the quietness. There was no announcement to the world that something had been hidden. There was simply the slow tabulation of cosmic particles, and at the end of it a chamber appeared, where no chamber had been on any map, and the chamber had been there the entire time. And the surface of Egypt has not in any of the years since stopped producing such moments. In February of 2006, an American Egyptologist named Otto Scharden was supervising a clearing operation in the Valley of the Kings, only 15 meters from the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. His workmen turned up the upper edge of a vertical shaft that no map had ever recorded. The shaft descended 5 meters into the bedrock and opened into a small chamber. The chamber contained 7 anthropoid coffins and 28 large storage jars, sealed at their mouths with mud plugs. The coffins held no mummies. The jars contained natron, embalming linens, animal bones, floral collars, and shards of pottery. It was an embalming cache, the residue of the work that had been done on some royal or noble body, sealed off and forgotten when the work was done. Scharden's team called the tomb KV63. It was the first sealed tomb to be opened in the Valley of the King since Carter opened Tutankhamun's 84 years earlier. 12 years after that, in November of 2018, a team led by the Egyptian archaeologist Mostafa Waziri was working at Saqqara, in a corridor of mastaba tombs about a kilometre from the Step Pyramid. They located an undisturbed shaft sealed since the 5th dynasty. The tomb belonged to a priest named Wahtiye, who had served the king Neferkare Kakai around 2,400 years before the Common Era. Inside the tomb were 18 niches with statues of the priest, his mother, his wife, and his children. The colours on the reliefs when the chamber was opened were still bright: yellow ochre, red iron oxide, green malachite, pigments mixed by an apprentice 44 centuries earlier, still adhering to the wall. Then, in the first week of February 2023, the same season the Scan Pyramids team was preparing to confirm the north face corridor, Zahi Hawass announced from a different shaft at Saqqara a sarcophagus that had been sealed since roughly 2300 before the Common Era. Inside the sarcophagus was the mummy of a man named Hekashepes. His body was covered in gold leaf. According to Hawass, he was the oldest non-royal, gold-covered mummy ever recovered from the soil of Egypt. The lid of his sarcophagus had not been moved since the day of his burial. What I want to make plain about these recent discoveries is not that they are individually spectacular, though each of them is. The point is the pattern they form together. Egypt is not done. 2 centuries after Napoleon's savants triangulated the country, 200 years after Champollion read the hieroglyphs, 100 years after Carter knelt at the door of KV62, the soil is still giving up sealed rooms year after year, on a schedule that does not appear to be slowing. Now let us pause for a moment and consider what this means. In the dossier of Egyptian archaeology, we have inherited 2 categories of evidence. We have the things that were left visible, never sealed, never lost. The pyramids of Giza, monumental, never hidden. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, in use almost continuously for 30 centuries. the Colossi of Memnon, Abu Simbel, the Sphinx. These were the public face of pharaonic civilization. They were meant to be seen. And we have the things that were sealed, the tombs, the caches, the shafts, the chambers behind chambers, the voids inside the voids. These were meant not to be seen. They were closed by intention, with stamps and walls and rubble, and consigned to a kind of deliberate invisibility. For 2 centuries we have been opening the second category and adding it to the first. When we do this, when we open the sealed thing and add it to the visible record, we are reversing a decision that someone made roughly 3,000 years ago. We are also, in a sense, completing it. The Egyptian priests who arranged these burials believed in a long afterlife. They believed the dead continued in some form to receive offerings, to be addressed by name, to live in the memory of the living. The act of sealing was not the act of forgetting. It was the act of placing something into a different mode of existence, in which the name persisted, and the body persisted, and the goods persisted, but the location was withheld. We are, in other words, doing something the priests did not intend when we open these doors. But we are also doing something they would have understood. We are speaking the name. We are touching the goods. We are keeping the dead in conversation with the living. This is a strange enterprise to be engaged in after 33 centuries. It is not exactly archaeology, it is not exactly history. It is something in between that we do not entirely have a word for. Now let us return for a moment to the documents that were composed by the Egyptian state itself in the late period of the New Kingdom about its own tombs. The Abbot Papyrus, mentioned in passing earlier, is held now at the British Museum in London, catalogued as Papyrus 1021. It is one of a small group of related papyri that survived from the reign of Rameses IX, around 1110 before the Common Era. The state, by this point, was visibly disintegrating. Famine, civil unrest, foreign incursion, and a chronic shortage of silver had hollowed out the central administration, and the tombs of the kings in the cliffs above the west bank of Thebes were being broken into at a rate the state could no longer contain. The papyri document a commission. The mayor of eastern Thebes, a man named Parsa, made accusations against the mayor of western Thebes, a man named Power, alleging that Power was allowing tombs in his district to be plundered. The accusation triggered an inquest. A panel of officials, in year 16 of the reign of Rameses IX, was sent to inspect the royal necropolis. They went to each tomb. They examined the seals. They recorded their findings. Of 10 royal tombs inspected, the panel reported that 9 were intact. 1, the tomb of King Sobekemsaf, the second of the 17th dynasty, had been broken into. The panel cited specific damage, including the violation of the king's body and the removal of his jewellery. 2 robbers were arrested. They confessed. Their confessions were recorded on a separate papyrus, the Leopold II papyrus, now divided between the Musées Royaux in Brussels and the British Museum. The confessions described the burial chamber in detail, including the gold on the king, the gold on the queen beside him, the order in which the shrines had been broken open. The robbers were executed. The case is famous in Egyptology because it is one of the few moments in which the Egyptian state speaks, in its own documents, about the violation of its own dead. The vocabulary is plain, the procedural language is professional, the names of the officials are recorded, the case is closed. What is striking about the Abbot Papyrus when you read it now is not that it documents a single robbery. It is that the panel reported the other 9 tombs as intact, and we know from subsequent archaeology that this report was false. The other tombs were also being robbed. The reports were either incompetent or dishonest. The panel saw what it wanted to see, or what it had been told to see, and recorded its findings. And the document went into the state archive, and the tombs went on being looted. And within a generation or two, the priests of the 21st dynasty would begin the great cache program that consolidated the surviving royal mummies into a small number of secret locations. What I keep coming back to in the Abbot Papyrus is this: the Egyptian state knew. It knew tombs were being violated. It generated an internal document to address the problem. It recorded the names of the inspectors and the names of the accused. It executed 2 men. And then the violations continued on a larger scale than before, and the state did nothing further. The record is preserved. The action that the record was supposed to prompt did not happen. 3,000 years later, the document is in a glass case in London. Anyone can request a viewing of it through the British Museum study room. The names are still there, the inquest is still there. The lie, if it was a lie, is still legible. Consider what kind of memory this is. It is not the memory of what was done, it is the memory of what was said about what was done. And those two things, in the late New Kingdom, as in our own century, are not always the same thing. The German cultural theorist Elida Assmann of the University of Constance, whose work on cultural memory I have returned to many times when thinking about these matters, has written that every state generates two kinds of archive. There is the active archive, which is consulted, cited, taught, and used to make decisions. And there is the passive archive, which is preserved but not consulted, kept somewhere on a shelf in a basement, not destroyed but not engaged with either. The passive archive, Assmann argues, is always the larger of the two. It is the volume of recorded human action that any given generation allows to lie unread. The Abbott Papyrus for nearly 30 centuries was in the passive archive of human memory. It sat somewhere, in some collection, in some unexamined bundle of documents, and no one consulted it. Then, in the 19th century, someone read it, and it crossed the threshold into the active archive. We know about the inquest of year 16 of Rameses IX because of that one decision in the 19th century to read the document. And it is reasonable to suppose that there are many such documents still in the passive archive that have not yet been read. Now let me describe one more contested case before we bring this evening's conversation toward its close. In the summer of 2015, the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, who had spent decades working on the Valley of the Kings and had served as a curator at both the British Museum and the Metropolitan, published a working paper through the Madrid Conservation Institute Factum Arte. The paper was titled The Burial of Nefertiti. Reeves had been examining high-resolution scans of the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. These scans had been produced by Factum Arte in 2009 as part of a project to create a facsimile of the tomb that could be visited by tourists while the original was closed for conservation. The scans were precise enough to detect changes in the surface of the painted plaster of fractions of a millimetre. What Reeves believed he saw, behind the painted scenes on the north and west walls of the burial chamber, were the outlines of doorways that had been blocked, plastered over, and painted before the chamber was officially closed. Doorways that led, he proposed, to additional rooms that had never been entered. His hypothesis was specific. He proposed that Tutankhamun's burial chamber was not, in fact, the original tomb. It was a secondary use of a tomb originally built for someone else. And the someone else, in Reeves's hypothesis, was Nefertiti, the chief queen of Akhenaten, whose own burial had never been located, whose mummy had never been identified with certainty, and who Reeves believed had ruled briefly as pharaoh, under the name Smenkhkare, or possibly Ankh-Kheperur, before Tutankhamun's accession. If Reeves was correct, the rooms behind the painted walls would contain Nefertiti. The hypothesis was tested with ground-penetrating radar 3 times, by 3 separate teams between 2015 and 2018. The first test, conducted by the Japanese radar specialist Hirokatsu Watanabe in late 2015, produced data that Watanabe interpreted as 90% indicative of voids behind the walls. The Egyptian Antiquities Service held a press conference. The world's papers carried the story. A second test, conducted in early 2016 by a National Geographic team using different radar equipment, produced inconclusive results. A third test, conducted in 2018 by a team from the Politecnico di Milano using ground-penetrating radar with broader frequency coverage and higher resolution than the earlier surveys, produced data that the team interpreted as showing no voids at all. The walls, they concluded, were solid limestone behind the plaster. The third team published their results in the journal Nature in May of 2018. The mainstream Egyptological community has, since then, largely treated the Nefertiti hypothesis as effectively disproved. Reeves has continued to defend it. As of this recording, no further radar tests have been authorized, and the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber remain unbreached. What I find interesting about this case is not whether Reeves is right or wrong. I do not know whether he is right or wrong. 3 radar tests with 3 contradictory results do not produce certainty. They produce instead a kind of question that hovers very quietly above the wall in question. But here is the part of the case that stays with me. If there are no rooms behind those walls, then the Nefertiti hypothesis is a beautiful theory that did not survive contact with the evidence, And that is the end of the story. If there are rooms behind those walls, then the queen of the 18th dynasty has been sealed inside her own grave for 33 centuries. And her name has been on the tongue of every Egyptologist for 150 years. And we've been standing 8 feet away from her without knowing it. I do not need to know which of these is the case to find that interval between the 8 feet and the certainty instructive. Because the rest of the country, the rest of the necropolises, the rest of the cliffs and the sands and the long quiet stretches of the river valley are also full of 8-foot distances of this kind. Some of them will be opened in this century. Some of them will be opened in centuries that have not yet begun. Some of them will not be opened at all, and the names inside them and the bodies and the goods will lie where they were placed, and the seal will hold. What I find especially worth pausing on in the cash program of the 21st dynasty is the bureaucratic patience of it. When the priests of Amun at Karnak realised in the second half of the 11th century, before the Common Era, that the Valley of the Kings could no longer be defended from systematic robbery, they did not lament. They did not write public laments at any rate that have survived. What they did was open a project. Over a period of roughly 50 years, between approximately 1090 and 1040 before the Common Era, they entered the older tombs, extracted the royal mummies, rewrapped many of them, applied new dockets identifying the king inside, and transferred them in groups to secondary locations. Some they put inside the tomb of a previous king, some they put inside a queen's tomb, and in the case of the largest single transfer, more than 40 of them, they sealed inside a previously unknown shaft above the temple of Deir el-Bahri. The shaft, today called TT320 or DB320, was located in the cliff above the temple, in a place that does not seem to have had any prior royal use. It was the family tomb of Pinegem II, the high priest of Amun, who served around 990 to 969 before the Common Era. His own family was buried there, and alongside his family, in the same chambers, the priest placed the dead of half a dynasty. Amos I, the founder of the new kingdom, was placed there. Amenhotep I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Seti I, Rameses I, Rameses II, the great Rameses, the one whose statue Shelley wrote about, was wrapped in plain linen and laid on the floor in a passage. And then the shaft was sealed. The seal held for approximately 2,900 years. In June of 1881, the Inspector of Antiquities for Upper Egypt, a German-born scholar named Emile Brugsch, who served as the deputy of Auguste Mariette and then of Gaston Maspero, was sent to Luxor to investigate the source of royal antiquities that had been appearing on the European market for the previous decade. He had been given the name of a family in the village of Gourna, on the West Bank, the Abd el-Rasul brothers, who had been quietly trading in objects whose provenance was clearly royal, but whose tomb of origin no one outside their family could identify. Under pressure, one of the brothers, Mohammed Abd el-Rasul, agreed to lead Brugsch to the source. What happened on the 25th of June, 1881, is one of the strangest episodes in the history of archaeology. Brugsch was lowered down the shaft. He landed in a corridor. He held up his torch. And what his torch showed him, in coffin after coffin, mummy after mummy, neatly arranged along both walls and stacked in the side chambers, was almost the entire pharaonic line of the New Kingdom. Brugsch had not been trained for what he was looking at. He had a few hours to grasp the scale of it. He estimated, in those first hours, that he was looking at more royal mummies than had previously been recovered in the whole history of Egyptology to that point. He was correct. He then made a decision that has been controversial ever since. Concerned that the local population, which he distrusted, would re-rob the cache if the news of its location spread, he chose to clear the shaft in 2 days. He brought in 300 local labourers. He had them carry the coffins down the cliff face to the river, where a steamer was waiting to take them to Cairo. The work was done in roughly 48 hours. No detailed in situ photographs were taken. No systematic mapping of the original positions of the coffins was made. The mummies were stripped from their context with extraordinary speed. We have today the bodies. We do not have in any complete form the record of how they were laid out when Pinegem's priests left them. Gaston Maspero published the inventory 8 years later. The volume, Les Momies Royales de Deir el-Bahari, appeared in 1889, and it remains the canonical reference. In it, Maspero listed dozens of royal mummies, alongside the priestly burials of Pinejem's own family. The dates of the kings range from the early 18th dynasty through the late 21st. Now, here is where the pattern becomes visible. 17 years later, in March of 1898, Victor Loret, the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, who had succeeded Maspero in the position, was working in the Valley of the Kings. He cleared rubble from the entrance to a tomb that had been catalogued but never fully entered, the tomb of Amenhotep II, today designated KV35. He descended the corridor. He entered the burial chamber, and in a side chamber off the main hall, he found another cache. 9 more royal mummies were inside: Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Merneptah, Seti II, Siptah, Setnakhtah, Rameses IV, Rameses V, Rameses VI, plus several anonymous individuals, including 2 women who would not be identified for more than a century. One of these women, known for many years simply as the Younger Lady, was identified in 2010 through DNA analysis carried out at the Egyptian Museum as the mother of Tutankhamun. What this means is the following: the cache program of the 21st dynasty was not a single event. It was distributed across multiple locations. The priests, knowing that no single shaft could be perfectly hidden, divided the royal dead among at least 2 separate caches, possibly more, and the second of these caches was not located for another 17 years after the first. Egypt, for the entire 19th century and the early 20th, had been giving up sealed rooms full of kings. It is worth pausing here to consider what the priests of Pinijem were doing. They were not preserving the kings out of respect for them as kings. Exactly. The Egyptian afterlife belief was not the modern Western conception, in which the soul departs and the body is left behind. The Egyptian doctrine held that the body itself was a residence for the ka, one of the several components of the human person, and that the ka required continuing connection to the preserved body in order to persist. To rob the tomb was, in Egyptian religious terms, not simply theft. It was a kind of murder performed against a person already deceased, by destroying the conditions under which they could continue to exist. When the priests of Panajem moved the kings, they were performing an act of theological rescue. They could not protect the original tombs, they could protect the bodies. So they took the bodies and hid them, and consigned the original tombs to whatever fate the robbers would visit on them. What they could not have anticipated is that in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, the methods of the archaeologist would mean that both the original tombs and the secondary caches would, eventually, be opened, and that the bodies they had so carefully hidden would be transferred to a building in central Cairo, placed in glass cases and shown to tourists. The current resting place of most of the kings whom Pinejim hid is the Royal Mummies Hall of the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Fustat, a southern district of Cairo. They were moved there in April of 2021 in a public procession that the Egyptian government called the Pharaoh's Golden Parade. 22 royal mummies, among them Rameses II and Seti I and Hatshepsut, were carried through the streets of the city in environmentally controlled capsules, mounted on golden floats, escorted by replica chariots, with helicopters overhead, and a televised broadcast that reached, according to the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism, an audience of more than 400 million people. The bodies that Pinejem's priests had spent decades hiding were, on the 3rd of April 2021, the most visible objects on Egyptian television. I do not know what to make of this. I am not sure anyone does. The kings have been recovered. The kings are now exhibited. The whole apparatus by which the priests of the 21st dynasty arranged for the king's continued existence has been deconstructed, examined, photographed, and replaced with a different apparatus of preservation that uses humidity controls and ultraviolet filtration and security cameras. Whether this counts in any Egyptian theological sense as a continuation of the rescue Pinejim performed, or as the final undoing of it, is a question I am not equipped to answer. What I can tell you is that there is one more cache, of a quite different kind, that I want to bring into this conversation before we close it. In February of 1940, in the eastern Nile Delta, at the site of Tanis, the French Egyptologist Pierre Montet was working in the precinct of the Temple of Amun. He had been excavating there since 1929. He was looking for evidence of the late period capital that had been built in the Delta after the New Kingdom collapse, when the kings of the 21st and 22nd dynasties had moved their seat of government north, away from Thebes. The world was, by this point, at war. France had been invaded the previous September. Egypt, under British protection, was effectively cut off from European supply lines. Montet was working with limited resources in a country preparing for a German advance that would not actually arrive in the way that everyone in February of 1940 expected. In that month, his team uncovered a granite plug sealing a passage in the temple precinct. The plug had been cut from a reused obelisk of Rameses II. Behind the plug was a vertical shaft. The shaft descended to a chamber, and the chamber held a stone sarcophagus, and the sarcophagus held a second sarcophagus of pink granite, and the pink granite sarcophagus held a third anthropoid coffin made of solid silver. The coffin held the body of Susenes I, pharaoh of the 21st dynasty, who had ruled approximately 1039 to 991 before the Common Era. He had been a near contemporary of the Pine Gem priests who were hiding the southern kings. He was buried in his own delta capital, with a treasure that the war would prevent the world from properly seeing. The press conference Montet would normally have held was effectively muted by the geopolitical context. The German invasion of Belgium and France was 3 months away. The discovery of an intact pharaonic tomb, with grave goods comparable in scale and craftsmanship to those of Tutankhamun, was reported in the international papers, but reported quietly. The world was in that spring of 1940 preoccupied. Tanis is not today a name that the general public associates with the great moments of Egyptian discovery. Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in a moment of peace, and the photographs of it travelled, and the world saw them. Susenes was opened on the eve of the worst war in human history, and the photographs sat in archives, and the world did not look. Consider the difference. The same kind of discovery, comparable wealth, comparable preservation. The first becomes a touchstone of 20th century culture. The second is footnotes. This too is part of the pattern we have been tracing. What gets remembered, what enters the active archive of public memory, is not strictly proportional to what was found. It is also proportional to when it was found, and to what else was happening at the moment, and to whether the photographs were ready to travel. Tutankhamun was found at the right moment. The world was hungry for him. The pictures went out. The story stayed. Susenes was found at the wrong moment. The world had other concerns. The pictures stayed in the archive. The story slid. Now, let us hold this for a moment, because it has implications. If the visibility of Egyptian archaeology depends in part on the political and emotional climate of the moment of its discovery, then there is no reason to think that all the great discoveries of Egyptian archaeology have been discoveries made in conditions of peace and prosperity. Some have been made in conditions of war. Some have been made in conditions of plague. Some have been made in conditions of revolution. The discoveries themselves do not know what year it is. They surface when they surface, and the question of what the world remembers about them is decided by factors that have very little to do with what was inside the chamber. Susenes I is in a glass case now. His solid silver coffin is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. You can walk up to it. You can consider the craftsmanship. The face on the coffin is a face. The eyes were once inlaid. The expression, in the silver, is calm. He is not famous. He could have been. He simply was not opened in a year in which the world had the bandwidth to make him famous. What this tells me when I put it next to the Tutankhamun story is that fame is a kind of accident. The body in the tomb does not care whether the world remembers its name. The body persists, in the condition the embalmers left it in, regardless. It is the world above the tomb that decides whether to look, and the world above the tomb is busy. The world above the tomb is always busy. Let us widen the lens one more time before we begin the return. Egypt is not the only country in which sealed rooms have produced kings. In 1974, in the Chinese province of Shanxi, farmers digging a well struck a hollow ceramic figure of a soldier. They had located, by accident, the burial complex of the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang, who died in 210, before the Common Era, and who was buried with an army of life-size terracotta figures, more than 8,000 of them, in chambers that had lain hidden in the soil for more than 2,000 years. 2 years later, in 1976, at the Yin ruins near Anyang, an undisturbed tomb was opened that contained the burial of a queen of the Shang dynasty named Fu Hao, who had died around 1200 before the Common Era, and whose grave goods included 16 sacrificed humans, 6 sacrificed dogs, and nearly 2,000 bronze, jade, and bone artifacts. The pattern, in other words, is not Egyptian. It is human. Where there were states with the resources to build sealed tombs, there were sealed tombs. Where there were sealed tombs, there were robberies sometimes, and intact survivals sometimes. And the intact survivals are still being opened, in country after country, by archaeologists working with current methods, and the count of what was sealed is still being updated, generation by generation. What I keep coming back to, when I think about all of this in the round, is the patience of the original act. Someone in each of these places, 3,000 years ago, 4,000, in some cases 5, walked into a chamber, set down a body, set down the goods that would accompany the body, walked out and sealed the door. They did not expect the door to be reopened. They did not write a note for the people who would, in fact, eventually reopen it. They simply sealed it and went home and resumed their lives and died in their own turn and were sealed in chambers of their own by people who had inherited the same set of habits from them. And the chamber stayed sealed in their thousands across continents. And we, in the centuries that we happen to live in, are opening some of them and looking inside and discovering that the dust is still there and the goods are still there and the names are still legible. And the work of the priests who never imagined us is the reason we know what we know. There is a reason I keep returning, in my own thinking, to the Egyptian case rather than the Chinese or any other. It is not that the Egyptian tombs are more important. They are not, except by accident, of how Western archaeology developed and how widely its photographs travelled. Tutankhamun's image moved through the popular press of the 1920s in a way that Qin Shi Huang's Terracotta Army, opened in 1974, did not. Egypt got there first in the global imagination, and the order of arrival mattered. It is also not that the Egyptian record is more complete. The Chinese record, for the periods we are talking about, is in many respects better documented than the Egyptian. The Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, writing around 100 before the Common Era, gave a fairly detailed account of Qin Shi Huang's tomb, including the claim that the chamber was filled with mercury rivers, and that the workers who knew the layout were sealed inside with the emperor. Some of that account, including the mercury, has been corroborated by modern surveys of the soil above the unopened central mound. Sima Qian was, in this respect, a more useful chronicler than anything the Egyptian state produced for itself. What draws me back to Egypt, when I try to articulate it, is the photograph. Egypt was photographed first. I do not mean the country as a whole, I mean the tombs. The Egyptian opening coincided with the development of photography in a way that no other comparable opening did. Belzoni entered Seti's tomb in 1817, when photography did not yet exist. Mariette opened the Serapeum in 1851, when photography existed, but was still rare. Maxime Duchamp made his calotypes of the monuments in 1849 and 1850, just barely catching them in the new medium. By the time of Maspero in the 1880s, photography was routine. By the time of Carter in 1922, Harry Burton was setting up gelatin silver plates in the actual burial chamber, and producing images that are still in the active circulation of art history today. The Egyptian record was generated under the lens of a medium that was, in those decades, becoming the dominant medium of the entire global culture. The same Egypt that had been sealed by priests 3,000 years earlier was reopened in the moment when the reopening could be photographed. The photographs went where the bodies did not. They went into magazines, into books, into newspapers, into the bedrooms of children in Liverpool and Buenos Aires and Tokyo. They became the way that the modern world recognized antiquity. When you imagine an Egyptian burial today, you are almost certainly imagining a Burton photograph, even if you have never heard his name. This is why the recursive loop in this story ends with a photograph. It always does. Let us go back, then, to where we began. In the Griffith Institute at Oxford, there is a glass plate negative made by Harry Burton on a date in late 1923. The negative shows the second of the 4 nested shrines that surrounded Tutankhamun's sarcophagus. Across the doors of that shrine, between the 2 copper handles, a length of rope is tied, and at the knot of the rope, a clay seal is pressed. The seal bears the image of the jackal god Anubis, lying above 9 bound captives. This is the seal of the Royal Necropolis. It was applied in the Necropolis workshop, by hand, by a person whose name we do not have, in the days following the burial of Tutankhamun, around 1323 before the Common Era. The seal was photographed by Burton 3,245 years after it was set. When Burton took that photograph, the rope was still tied, the seal was still pressed onto the knot. The hand that had set it had been dead for 32 centuries. The clay was still doing the work the hand had asked it to do. There is a detail in this photograph that almost nobody mentions. The clay of the seal is slightly imperfect. You can see the press of the cylinder, and you can see where the cylinder did not roll cleanly. So the image of Anubis is slightly compressed on one side. A small thing. A thing the priest noticed, perhaps, and then decided not to redo. A thing he or she let go, because the seal would only ever be looked at once again, and that once again would be at the resurrection of the king, at which point the imperfect seal would not matter. The priest was wrong about the once again. The seal was looked at again, in 1923, by Burton, and then again in the years since, by every visitor to the Griffith Institute archive online, by every reader of every book on Tutankhamun, by anyone who has ever turned the page of a National Geographic magazine and paused on the image. What the priest meant for one viewer, the camera converted into a viewing by millions. A private act of sealing was made, by accident of timing, into a public act of looking. What I keep coming back to is that. Not the gold of the inner coffin, not the canopic chest, not the strange trumpets in the antechamber that Carter handled, and that briefly played a note for the first time in 3,000 years. What I keep coming back to is the seal, because the seal is the moment where the intention of the priest and the action of the modern world meet directly. The priest sealed the door, the world eventually took a picture of the sealing, and the picture exists because the seal existed, and the seal existed because the priest, working in some now unnamed evening in the late 14th century, before the Common Era, pressed a cylinder into damp clay and walked away. The clay held, the photograph holds, the seal is in a vitrine somewhere in the Egyptian collection now. I have not seen it personally. I have seen Burton's image of it, which is a different thing. The image is the version of the seal that has travelled. The seal itself, the physical object, has barely moved at all since the day it was photographed, and barely moved since the day it was pressed. This is what these stories do. When you look at enough of them together, they turn out to be stories about objects that stayed in place while everything around them changed. The state of Egypt rose and fell and rose again, several times over, in the span between the pressing of the seal and the photographing of the seal. Languages changed, religions changed. The pyramids themselves were ransacked, restored, abandoned, rediscovered. The seal did none of those things. The seal sat in the dark on the rope, between the two handles, in the position it had been left in, and waited. This is the part of the story that I am unable to be neutral about. I have spent years with these photographs. And the seal of Anubis over the 9 captives is the one that, for me, makes the rest of it bearable. Because it is proof that, however badly the rest of the record was treated afterward, however violently the tombs were opened, however quickly the bodies were stripped from their context and carted to Cairo in 48 hours by Emil Brugsch and his 300 labourers, the original act, the act of sealing, was honoured by the world for as long as the world was capable of honouring it. The seal lasted as long as the dark lasted. When the dark ended, the seal ended. The two are the same thing. That, I think, is the most honest answer I can give you about what these tombs are. They are not, in the end, about kings. The kings are inside them, but the kings are the smallest part of what is inside. The largest part is the time. 3,000 years of undisturbed time, sitting in a chamber, with nobody looking, with the dust gathering in the way that dust gathers, when no foot ever crosses the floor. That is the thing that the priest was preserving. That is the thing the modern world, by opening the chamber, brought to an end. What we received, when the chamber was opened, was not the king. The king was already dead. What we received was the time. We took the time, and we ended it. And we replaced it with whatever it is we now have. Whether what we have is better than what was sealed inside is a question that, for me, remains genuinely open. The photograph is still in the archive. The negative is still in its case at Oxford. The print is still hanging in some lecture halls, on some quiet university wall, where students walk past it without registering what they are seeing. The seal of Anubis is still pressed into its clay. The cylinder is still slightly out of alignment on one side. The rope is still tied. The handles are still copper. The priest whose hand did this is still anonymous. Someone, somewhere, is reading this story right now. In a room, late with the lamp on, and the clay of that seal is just as real, just as physical, as the lamp. The records survived. Someone kept them. The conversation continues, If this story stayed with you, a like helps other patient eyes find this archive. There is more waiting for you in the playlist. Other documents, other erasures, other photographs that the standard history does not quite explain. The records survived. Someone, somewhere, kept them. We are reading them again now. Thank you for staying with me through this story.